The silence in the small apartment was the loudest sound Elena had ever heard. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that pressed in on her, amplifying the frantic thumping of her own heart. The eviction notice, a single sheet of cheap paper, lay on the bare kitchen counter. Its bold, black letters a final, brutal judgment. Her gaze drifted from the notice to her hands, which she had spread flat on the wood. They were a seamstress's hands, calloused and pricked by 1,000 needles, but now they were still useless. Her sewing machine, her source of life, had been sold weeks ago. Next to her hands lay the entirety of their world, 2 $20 bills, 1 $5, and a small, pathetic pile of coins. $45. She counted it again, as if the numbers might magically change. A sharp, acidic pang of hunger twisted her stomach, a familiar ache she had been ignoring for days. In the other room, she could hear the soft, rhythmic breathing of her 7-year-old son, Leo, asleep on a mattress on the floor, the last piece of furniture they owned. A wave of shame and love so fierce it felt like a physical blow washed over her. He was all she had left since the accident, since the day the world had crumbled, and she felt she was failing him with every breath she took. The worn cardboard suitcase, held together by a fraying length of rope, felt impossibly heavy. It contained everything they had left: a few changes of clothes, Leo's favorite worn-out picture book, and the last shirt her husband had ever worn. As she folded it, the faint scent of him, sawdust and sweat and a life of hard work, rose from the fabric, and a sob caught in her throat, hot and sharp. She had to swallow it down, crushing the grief into a hard little ball in her chest. There was no time for tears. The construction company had made that clear. "It's not our responsibility," the man in the suit had said, his voice as cold and sterile as the office he sat in. No compensation, no apology, just a closed door. Eleanor ran a hand over the wall by the doorframe, where pencil marks charted Leo's growth, a history of happier times that now felt like a story about someone else. Taking Leo's small, warm hand in her own, she pulled the apartment door closed one last time. The click of the lock echoed in the empty hallway, a sound of absolute finality. They were outside. The city air, thick with exhaust fumes and the distant wail of a siren, felt foreign and hostile. They were officially homeless. The walk was a slow, agonizing trek through a city that no longer felt like home. The weight of the suitcase dug into her palm, sending sharp pains up her arm, but the weight in her soul was heavier still. They moved from familiar residential streets, past brightly lit cafes and warm houses, into the grey, forgotten fringes of the city. The landscape transformed into a wasteland of crumbling warehouses, chain-link fences topped with rust-colored barbed wire, and forgotten lots choked with weeds. The smell changed, too, from the scent of food and life to the metallic tang of industry and the damp, earthy odor of decay. Leo, his small legs struggling to keep up, looked up at her, his eyes wide with confusion and a dawning fear. "Mama, where are we going?" he asked, his voice small against the roar of a passing truck. Elena's throat tightened into a knot of unshed tears. She couldn't form the words. She couldn't tell him they were going to a place where broken things and broken people were left to rust away. She just squeezed his hand tighter, the bones of his small fingers a fragile anchor in the overwhelming sea of her despair, and kept walking toward the rising skeletons of the rail yard. The rail yard was a necropolis of steel. Dozens of train cars, hulking and silent, stood in long, decaying lines, their metal skins blistered with rust and scarred with graffiti. They looked like the fossilized remains of giant, prehistoric beasts. A cold wind whipped through the open spaces between them, creating a low, moaning sound that felt like the lament of 1,000 lost souls. The air was thick with the smell of creosote, stagnant water, and something else, the smell of human desperation. In the deepening twilight, Eleanor could see shadowy figures moving near a fire, burning in a steel drum, their faces gaunt and hollowed out by hardship. A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air crawled up her spine. A raw, primal fear gripped her. This was no place for a child. This was a place of danger, of predators and prey, a last resort for those who had fallen through every crack in society. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had thought the empty apartment was the bottom, but she realized now that the bottom was a dark, terrifying abyss. and they were still falling. She pulled Leo closer, trying to shield his small body with her own, as if she could protect him from the grim reality of where his mother had brought him. Her eyes scanned the rows of freight cars, most of which were open to the elements, their interiors filled with garbage and filth. A sense of panic began to bubble up in her chest. They couldn't sleep out in the open. Not here. Leo was shivering now, his teeth chattering softly. "I'm cold, Mama," he whispered, and the words were like a blade in her heart. She had to find something, anything. Then, her desperate gaze fell upon it. Set back from the main tracks, partially hidden behind a screen of thorny, overgrown bushes, was a single passenger car. It was old, its windows shattered and dark, but it was set apart, offering the faintest illusion of privacy and solitude. It was a metal tomb, but it had a roof. A surge of something that felt grotesquely like relief washed through her. She dragged the suitcase through the weeds, the sharp branches scratching at her legs, and pulled Leo along behind her. The train car loomed over them, a dark and silent hulk. Its door was slightly ajar. Elena reached out a trembling hand and pushed. The metal groaned in protest, the sound echoing in the desolate silence. This was it. She took a deep breath that tasted of rust and ruin. This was their new home. The heavy metal door groaned open under her push, releasing a gust of trapped air that struck her like a physical blow. It was a foul, gagging exhalation, a scent compounded of decades of dampness, rot, and human neglect. Elena's hand, still pressed against the cold, rusted steel, trembled violently. A small, fragile bubble of hope had been growing in her chest. The hope of a roof, of privacy, of a single place to call their own. But this smell threatened to pop it instantly. The odor was complex and horrifying. The sharp, acidic tang of mold, the faint but unmistakable stench of long-dried urine, and the heavy, sweetish smell of decay. She took an involuntary step back, her lungs rejecting the putrid air. Her heart, which had been hammering with a mix of fear and anticipation, now seemed to shrink in her chest, a cold knot of dread forming where hope had been. The darkness beyond the doorway seemed to breathe, ancient and unwell, waiting to swallow them whole. This was not a haven. A wave of pure panic washed over her. Forcing down the nausea that rose in her throat, Elena took a hesitant step inside, pulling a bewildered Leo in behind her. Her eyes struggled to adjust to the profound gloom, the only light coming from the open doorway and the slivers of grey twilight piercing the shattered windows. As the shapes within the long, narrow space resolved themselves, her heart sank into a deep, cold abyss. It was a scene of utter devastation. This was not an empty car. It was a gutted one. The passenger seats had been ripped out, their metal frames twisted and exposed like the ribs of a skeleton. Stuffing and rotted fabric was strewn across the floor, mixed with piles of garbage, broken bottles, and unidentifiable filth. It felt less like an abandoned space and more like a violated one, a place where violence and despair had left a permanent, ugly stain. This wasn't a blank canvas for a new life. It was the spoiled aftermath of 100 sad stories, and she felt a chilling certainty that they were about to add their own. The silence of the rail yard was replaced by a new, more intimate soundscape of decay. A constant, low whistling sound came from the broken windows, where the wind screamed through the jagged shards of glass, a mournful, lonely cry. From somewhere in the ceiling, a steady drip, drip, drip of water echoed with maddening regularity, each drop landing with a soft splash on the debris-covered floor, a constant reminder of the car's brokenness. And underneath it all, there were other sounds, the faint, dry rustle of unseen things moving in the deepest shadows. Rats. She knew it instantly, and a shiver of revulsion and fear crawled up her spine. Her own breath sounded loud and ragged in her ears, each inhalation a struggle against the contaminated air. She felt trapped, the long, coffin-like shape of the car pressing in on her from all sides. Her brief flicker of hope was being systematically, brutally extinguished by the grim reality of this place. The cold was immediate and absolute. It wasn't just the evening chill. It was a deep, penetrating dampness that seemed to emanate from the very metal of the car itself. The walls offered no insulation, acting instead as conductors for the biting night air. Elena could feel it seeping through the thin fabric of her coat, chilling her to the bone. She ran a hand along the floor, recoiling at the slick, slimy film of grime that coated its surface. Every surface felt hostile and unwelcoming. She imagined trying to sleep here, the cold metal leaching the warmth from their bodies, the dampness creeping into their lungs. A profound sense of hopelessness washed over her. This wasn't a shelter, it was a trap, a beautifully constructed trap made of steel and rust, designed to break the spirits of those desperate enough to enter. She felt a terrible premonition that the winter nights here would be unsurvivable, a slow and frozen surrender to the elements. Leo, who had been silent until now, tightened his grip on her leg, burying his face into the fabric of her worn coat. He didn't cry or complain. His small body was just rigid with a terror that broke his mother's heart. This silent fear was so much worse than tears. It was the shock of a child whose world had not just been turned upside down, but utterly shattered. Elena felt a fresh wave of shame so powerful it made her dizzy. She had brought him here. She had promised him, with her actions, if not her words, a place of safety, and instead she had led him into a nightmare. She knelt, her knees protesting as they pressed into the hard, filthy floor, and tried to force a reassuring smile. "It's okay, mijo," she whispered, her voice a brittle, cracking thing. "We'll clean it up. We'll make it warm." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. She was promising him a miracle she had no idea how to perform, and the knowledge of her own helplessness was a crushing weight. Putting down the heavy cardboard suitcase with a thud that echoed unnervingly in the metallic space, Elena began the first impossible task, clearing a space to sleep. She used the side of her foot to shove a pile of sodden, moldy magazines and rotting food wrappers into a corner. The movement disturbed the air, releasing a fresh, concentrated wave of the stench of decay. The nausea she had been suppressing surged back, and she had to press her hand to her mouth, her stomach churning violently. Her body was screaming at her to flee, to run back out into the cold night, anywhere but here. But where would they go? The image of the men by the fire drum, their faces like skulls in the firelight, flashed in her mind. Out there was danger. In here was decay. She felt trapped between two different kinds of death. She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the foul air into her lungs, and continued her pathetic attempt to sweep with her shoe, her movements small and desperate. Her eyes fell upon what must have been the lavatory at the far end of the car. Its door hung crookedly from a single, rusted hinge, permanently ajar. A morbid curiosity mixed with a practical need to know the full extent of their new home's horror drew her closer. Peering into the tiny, dark space was a mistake. The stench that wafted out was overpowering, a concentrated miasma of filth and human waste that made her eyes water and her throat close. The inside was a scene of indescribable squalor, a testament to years of misuse and desperation. The sight sent a jolt of pure disgust and despair through her. This wasn't just neglect, it was a physical manifestation of human misery. Any lingering, microscopic speck of hope she had clung to, that maybe one corner could be made livable, was utterly annihilated. This place was a disease, and they were now living inside of it. A feeling of profound defeat settled over her, cold and heavy as a shroud. She turned away from the lavatory, her chest tight with revulsion, and began a frantic search for a single, small mercy. A dry patch of floor, a section of wall not slick with condensation. She ran her trembling fingers along the corrugated metal, but everywhere she touched, her skin came away damp and cold. The metal felt like the wall of a meat locker, icy and unforgiving. The steady drip, drip, drip from the ceiling wasn't coming from just one spot. As her eyes adjusted further, she could see the dark water stains spreading like veins across the roof, evidence of a dozen different leaks. The constant dripping was not just a sound, it was a clock, ticking down the moments until everything they owned, their clothes, their blankets. Leo's book was as damp and rotten as the rest of this tomb. She felt a tear of pure frustration and rage well in her eye. She had nothing, and this place was determined to take even that from her. With a heavy heart, she returned to the small space she had cleared. Her task now felt sacred and desperate, to build a nest for Leo, a tiny, fragile island of safety in this vast ocean of filth and cold. She clicked open the worn latches of their suitcase. The contents seemed to glow in the gloom. A few neatly folded clothes, the clean scent of their old life still clinging to the fabric. The contrast between that scent and the suffocating odor of the train car was so stark, so cruel, that a sob finally broke free from her throat, a ragged, painful sound. She choked it back down instantly, her jaw aching with the effort. She could not break. Not now. Not in front of him. He was watching her, his eyes wide and dark, mirroring her own fear. For his sake, she had to pretend that this was just a challenge, not a final, crushing defeat. She had to be the mother, the protector, even when she felt like a terrified child herself. Carefully, she took out the 2 thin blankets they owned and a worn sheet. She spread them meticulously on the floor, creating a small, pathetic bed in the corner. The clean fabric looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of grime. She tried to block a draft from the nearest shattered window by propping their now empty suitcase against the wall. It was a completely futile gesture. The wind simply whistled around it, but the act of trying, of doing something, was the only thing keeping the paralysis of despair at bay. She felt so incredibly small and powerless, a tiny insect struggling against a hurricane. The sheer scale of their problem, no food, no heat, no safety, no money, was an insurmountable mountain, and her resources were a handful of dust. A profound sense of futility settled in her bones. She was just arranging blankets on the floor of their grave. She was just making their end a little bit tidier. She sat Leo down on the makeshift bed, his small body sinking into the thin blankets. She wrapped the other blanket around his shivering shoulders, tucking it in tightly. "See, cozy," she lied, her voice hollow. From the suitcase, she pulled out his favorite picture book, the one with the brightly colored drawings of happy farm animals. In the oppressive gloom of the train car, the cheerful red barn and smiling pig looked like artifacts from another universe. She opened it onto his lap, but he didn't look at the pages. His gaze was fixed on the far end of the car, staring into the deep shadows where the sounds of scuttling were most pronounced. His face was pale and drawn in the dim light, his eyes huge and dark with an understanding that was far too old for a 7-year-old. He knew. He knew this wasn't an adventure. He knew this was the end of something. Elena's heart broke all over again. As the last of the grey light faded from the sky, the darkness inside the car became total, a thick and suffocating blanket of black. Elena fumbled for her phone, its battery life a precious and dwindling resource, and turned on the flashlight. The thin, weak beam cut a nervous path through the gloom, making the shadows dance and revealing new horrors. Strange stains on the walls, a scattering of what looked like bones in a corner, the glint of 100 broken shards of glass. Every sound was now magnified, amplified by the darkness and her frayed nerves. The creak and groan of the car as it settled on its tracks sounded like the sighs of a dying beast. Every distant shout from the rail yard was a potential threat. Her senses were screaming, on high alert for a danger she couldn't see but could feel in the very air. She felt utterly exposed, a doe and her fawn hiding in a wolf's den, praying the night would pass without notice. The gnawing ache in her stomach returned, now a sharp, demanding pain. They had not eaten since a small piece of bread that morning. The $45 in her pocket felt like a cruel joke. It was both a fortune and nothing at all. She couldn't leave Leo alone to search for a store. Not in this place, not in the dark. They would have to endure the hunger until morning. Her own stomach betrayed her with a loud, hollow growl that sounded obscene in the tense quiet. Leo stirred beside her, his small voice a thread of sound in the immense darkness. "I'm hungry, Mama." The 3 simple words pierced her more deeply than any physical blow could. They were an accusation, a plea, and a statement of fact she was powerless to change. She felt a hot shame flush her face, invisible in the blackness. "I know, my love," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Just try to sleep. We'll eat in the morning." She lay down on the hard floor beside him, pulling him into the curve of her body, trying desperately to create a pocket of warmth with their shared heat. The cold from the concrete and steel floor was brutal, seeping through the thin blankets and into her bones. There would be no sleep for her. She lay with her eyes wide open, staring into the oppressive blackness, her ears straining to interpret the symphony of the rail yard. The low moan of the wind was a constant lament. The sudden, violent clang of metal on metal somewhere in the yard made her jump. A woman's sharp, high-pitched cry was cut short, followed by mocking laughter. And closer, just beyond the thin beam of her phone, the constant unnerving scurrying of rats. A profound, soul-crushing loneliness settled over her, the feeling of being utterly and completely abandoned by the world, a piece of human refuse left to rot in a steel box. As Leo's shivering finally subsided and his breathing deepened into a fitful sleep, Elena allowed a single, hot tear to escape. It traced a cold path down her temple and into her hair. The desperate hope that had propelled her to this specific car, the illusion of privacy, the promise of a roof, had been a lie, a mirage in her desert of despair. This wasn't a home. It wasn't a sanctuary. It was a cold, damp tomb, and she could feel it slowly, patiently burying them alive. She had thought the eviction notice was the bottom. She had thought homelessness was the bottom. She was wrong. This was the bottom. This cold, hard, terrifying place where all light had died, where the air itself was poison, and where hope was a foreign concept. She felt the last ember of her own spirit flicker, starved of oxygen, and finally, in the crushing dark of the train car, go out. A few days had passed in a miserable haze of cold and hunger. Eleanor had managed to achieve a small, hollow victory against the filth, sweeping a single corner of the car into something resembling a clean space. She had used a piece of ripped metal siding as a dustpan and her own hands to gather the worst of the debris. It was here, on this pitifully small island of relative cleanliness, that Leo now tried to play. He had only one toy, a small die-cast metal truck that had been his father's as a boy. He ran it back and forth across the metal floor, making quiet engine noises with his mouth. The sound, a small pocket of childhood innocence in this vast tomb of decay, was both a comfort and a dagger in Elena's heart. She watched him, her stomach a tight, painful knot of hunger, trying to absorb the warmth of his small existence. This little corner was their entire world now, a fragile fortress against the creeping despair that filled every other inch of the cold, steel car. A sanctuary built on a foundation of rot and rust. Leo, lost in his imagination, gave the small truck a final, energetic push. It sped away from him, its tiny metal wheels rumbling loudly across the floor. The sound was a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet they had grown used to. The truck careened across their clean corner, crossed the invisible border back into the filth-strewn main floor, and continued on its journey toward the dark center of the car. Elena watched its progress, a faint, tired smile on her face. For a moment, it was just a boy playing with his toy. For a moment, the crushing reality of their situation receded, replaced by the simple physics of a rolling object. The rumble of the wheels was the only sound, a tiny engine of hope propelling itself into the gloom. The truck seemed to have a life of its own, a determined traveler exploring the desolate landscape of their new reality. It was a brief, fleeting moment of normalcy that felt more precious than anything she had ever owned. A tiny spark of light in the overwhelming darkness. The rumbling sound stopped abruptly. It wasn't the clatter of the truck hitting a wall or a pile of debris. It was a hollow, wooden thump, immediately followed by a soft, clattering echo that seemed to come from underneath the floor itself. Then silence, a heavy, profound silence that was far more alarming than the noise had been. Leo looked up, his eyes wide with surprise and confusion. "My truck," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. It had vanished, just disappeared into the floor. Elena's tired smile faded, replaced by a frown of annoyance. She got to her knees, the cold of the metal floor seeping instantly through the thin fabric of her pants. It was just one more thing to be lost, one more small hardship in an endless ocean of them. She crawled toward the spot where the truck had disappeared, her phone's flashlight beam cutting a shaky path ahead of her. She expected to find a simple hole, another testament to the car's decay. What she found was something else entirely. There was indeed a hole, but it was not the jagged, splintered maw of natural decay she had expected. It was a small, perfectly rectangular opening where a single floorboard had given way. Peering into the darkness, she could see Leo's truck resting on the dirt below, a glint of red metal in the gloom. Her first feeling was relief, quickly followed by irritation. Now she would have to reach into the filthy space to retrieve it, but as her fingers brushed against the edge of the hole, something felt wrong. The wood wasn't soft and rotten. It was firm. She ran her fingers along the edge of the adjoining board. It was a straight, clean line, too clean. A shiver, completely unrelated to the cold, traveled up her arm. She pushed her fingers against the board next to the hole, and it shifted slightly, moving with a smoothness that rot could never produce. Her heart began to beat a little faster, a low, nervous rhythm in her chest. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't decay. It was a cut. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind, dulled by hunger and despair, suddenly sharpened with a new, unfamiliar sensation, curiosity. She swept the flashlight beam around the area, her eyes tracing the lines in the floor. She could see it clearly now. A large, rectangular section of the floorboards, about 3 feet by 4, was outlined by these unnervingly straight cuts. They were disguised by decades of grime and dirt, but they were unmistakably deliberate. Someone had cut this section of the floor and then replaced it. Why? The question echoed in the sudden silence of her thoughts. This train car, this forgotten metal coffin, was not just a repository of random decay. It held a secret, a deliberate, hidden secret. A spark of adrenaline, the first she had felt in days that wasn't born of fear, shot through her. She forgot about the cold, the hunger, the rats. There was something here, something more than just dirt and despair. Putting her phone down so the beam pointed at the spot, Elena wedged her fingers into the gap where Leo's truck had fallen. She pulled. The board resisted, held fast by the weight of years. A grunt of effort escaped her lips. The wood was heavy, dense. She repositioned herself, getting a better grip, her fingers raw and scraping against the rough texture. She pulled again, with all the strength her malnourished body could muster, her muscles screaming in protest. There was a low, groaning sound, the complaint of old nails being forced from their resting place. A line of dirt and rust flaked away from the seam. A splinter drove deep into her finger, but she barely felt the sharp sting. All of her focus, all of her being was concentrated on this single, stubborn piece of wood. She had to know. The possibility, however faint, of what might lie beneath was a more powerful motivator than she could have imagined. It was the first glimmer of agency she'd had since her world fell apart. With a final, desperate heave, the board came loose with a loud crack and a shower of dust and rust. The sound echoed through the car like a gunshot. She tossed the heavy plank aside and peered into the opening she had created. It revealed not just the dirt patch where the truck lay, but a small, dark crawl space. It was about 2 feet deep, a pocket of blackness carved out beneath the car's floor. The air that rose from it was different from the moldy stench of the car. It was an ancient, earthy smell, the scent of dry dust, of still air, of things long undisturbed. It was the smell of a tomb, but a dry one. Her flashlight beam cut into the darkness, revealing a space cluttered with what looked like a pile of old, bundled rags in the far corner. Her heart pounded in her ears. This was it. This was the secret. She reached in, her hand trembling, and retrieved Leo's truck, the cold metal a small solid comfort in her palm. She handed the truck to a wide-eyed Leo, murmuring for him to stay put, before turning her full attention back to the crawl space. Her mind was racing. Who would build such a space, and why? Was it a place to hide things, or a place to hide a person? The pile of rags in the corner drew her gaze. They looked intentionally placed, a deliberate heap meant to conceal. Pushing aside her fear of spiders and whatever else might be living in the dark, she leaned further into the opening, extending her arm. Her fingers brushed against the fabric. It was coarse, heavy canvas, stiff with age. She grabbed a handful and pulled. The rags were surprisingly heavy, and as she dragged them aside, they uncovered not more dirt but a flat, dark surface, wood, and set into the center of it was a single, heavy, black iron ring, cold and solid to the touch. It was a hatch, a trapdoor leading down. A wave of dizziness washed over her. This was so much more than a hiding spot, a cold dread mixed with an almost unbearable excitement. A tunnel, beneath a train car, in a forgotten rail yard. It made no sense. It felt like something out of a child's adventure story, completely disconnected from her grim reality. A part of her, the logical, terrified mother, screamed to push the board back into place, to forget she ever saw it, to huddle with her son and focus on the immediate, tangible problem of survival. But another part of her, a part she thought had died, was captivated. This secret had been waiting here, in the dark, for years, for decades. What if it was the answer? It was an insane, irrational thought, but the seed of it had been planted. What if this was not just a curiosity, but a way out? She looked at Leo, his small face pale in the flashlight's glow, and the desperation that had been her constant companion transformed into a reckless, desperate courage. She had to know. The unknown below couldn't possibly be worse than the known despair above. She hooked her fingers, raw and splintered, through the cold iron ring. She braced her feet and pulled. It didn't budge. It was as if it were fused to the earth. She took a deep, shuddering breath, the dusty air filling her lungs, and tried again. She wrapped both hands around the ring, ignoring the bite of the cold metal, and threw her entire body weight backward. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, groaning shudder that seemed to vibrate up from the center of the earth, the hatch moved. A terrible screeching sound of rusted metal grinding against metal filled the small space. Slowly, inch by agonizing inch, she lifted the heavy wooden door. It was immensely heavy, and the strain sent a shooting pain through her back, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. With a final gasping effort, she heaved it all the way open, letting it fall back with a loud, hollow boom that echoed in the darkness below. Panting, she stared down into the abyss she had just uncovered. The beam of her phone's flashlight cut into a perfect, cylindrical blackness. The air that rose up to meet her was even colder, carrying the damp, mineral scent of deep earth and wet stone. It smelled ancient. She could see the tops of metal rungs set into a wall of dark, tightly fitted bricks descending into the gloom. A ladder. The tunnel was brick-lined, a work of careful, intentional construction. This was not some random sewer access. This was built for a purpose. A deep, primal fear prickled her skin. Tunnels were for hiding, for smuggling, for burying things that were never meant to be found. Every instinct for self-preservation told her to slam the hatch shut, but the image of Leo's shivering body and the sound of her own stomach's hungry growl were a more immediate threat. Whatever was down there, it was a choice. It was an unknown. And right now, the known was a slow, certain death by cold and starvation. The unknown, however terrifying, held the barest sliver of possibility. "I'll be right back, mijo," she whispered to Leo, her voice shaking. "You stay right here. Don't move, and don't make a sound." She placed her phone, the precious flashlight beam pointing downwards, on the edge of the opening so it would light her way. The thought of the battery dying while she was down there sent a fresh jolt of terror through her, but she pushed it away. She had to be quick. She swung her legs over the edge, her worn-out shoes searching for the first rung. Her foot connected with the cold and slick metal. It felt sturdy. She took a deep breath, the dusty air a poor substitute for courage, and began her descent. The opening above her shrank, the small square of the train car's squalor replaced by the all-encompassing darkness of the tunnel. She was leaving her known world behind, step by terrifying step, descending into a secret that had been waiting in the dark for longer than she had been alive. The descent was terrifying. The brick walls were slick with a fine layer of moisture, and the air grew colder and heavier with every rung. Her own breathing sounded unnervingly loud, a ragged counterpoint to the faint, steady drip of water from somewhere far below. The circular beam of her phone's light above cast her own shadow, a monstrous, elongated shape, on the wall in front of her. She felt like she was descending into the throat of some great sleeping beast. The smell of damp earth was overpowering now, a clean, raw smell so different from the decay in the car above. She focused on the simple mechanics of her movement, hand, foot, hand, foot. She refused to look down into the absolute blackness that her light didn't reach. She didn't want to know how far she had to go. She just kept moving, driven by a force she didn't understand, a strange mix of terror and blind, irrational hope. The world of the rail yard, of eviction and hunger, felt 1,000,000 miles away. After what felt like an eternity, her foot touched solid ground. She had descended about 30 feet. She stood for a moment in the small pool of light cast from the opening above, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was in a narrow, brick-lined tunnel that stretched forward into absolute darkness. It was just wide enough for one person to walk through. The air was still and incredibly cold, the silence so complete it seemed to press in on her eardrums. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers numb and clumsy, and retrieved it from the edge. Its beam felt pitifully small against the immense darkness. She swept the light forward. The tunnel was short. It ran for perhaps 30 feet before ending in what looked like a small, dry chamber, a dead end. And in the center of that chamber, waiting in the silent dark, were two objects. They were rectangular, dark, and they seemed to absorb the light. Her breath caught. They were satchels, heavy leather satchels. A wave of adrenaline hit her, so powerful it made her knees weak. She took a hesitant step forward, then another, her worn shoes making no sound on the dusty brick floor. The silence was absolute. The chamber was small, no more than 8 feet square, and miraculously, it was bone dry. The air here was different, still and stale, like the pages of a very old book. The two satchels sat side by side, covered in a fine layer of pale dust, like two sleeping animals. They were made of thick, dark brown leather turquoise with heavy brass buckles tarnished green with age. They looked old, expensive, and incredibly heavy. For a long moment, Elena just stood there, her light trained on them, her mind unable to process what she was seeing. It felt like a dream. After weeks of scavenging for scraps, of feeling like human garbage, she had stumbled into a treasure chamber. A profound, bone-deep feeling told her that her life, and the story of this place, was about to change forever. She knelt before the satchel, her knees cracking in the silence. Her hand, trembling, reached out to touch the one on the left. The leather was cold, stiff, and dry. It felt ancient. The dust was thick, a blanket of grey powder that had not been disturbed in generations. The brass buckles were cold and heavy. Her fingers fumbled with the clasp, her knuckles brushing against the cold metal. The mechanism was stiff, and she had to use both hands to force the corroded latch open. It gave way with a loud, metallic click that was shocking in the silent chamber. She slowly, reverently, lifted the heavy leather flap. The beam of her phone's light fell inside, and her breath hitched in a small, sharp gasp. The satchel was full. It was packed to the brim with neat, tight bundles of paper tied with faded string, and on the top of the very first bundle, she could see the ornate, curling script of a bank's name. They were bonds, old bank bonds. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She carefully lifted one of the bundles out. The paper was crisp, dry, and impossibly well preserved. It didn't feel real. She shone the light on the documents. They were bearer bonds from the 1950s and 60s, from banks that probably no longer existed. The denominations printed on them were staggering, numbers that her mind could barely comprehend. Thousands, tens of thousands, and the satchel was full of them. A frantic, hysterical laugh threatened to bubble up from her chest, but she choked it down. This couldn't be real. It was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by hunger and stress. She dug deeper into the satchel, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the flashlight steady. Beneath the bonds, there was more. Thick stacks of paper, folded and yellowed with age. She unfolded one. It was a property deed for a small farm, and it was signed, dated 1961. There were dozens of them, hundreds. She gently placed the deeds and bonds back into the satchel, her mind reeling. This was a fortune, a life-changing, impossible fortune. But it was also a story, a puzzle she didn't understand. Who owned this, and why was it hidden here, buried beneath a derelict train car? Her gaze shifted to the second satchel. It seemed somehow more ominous, its secret heavier. It felt different when she touched it, the leather softer, more supple. She unfastened the buckles, her movements more certain now, driven by a desperate need to understand. She lifted the flap. This satchel was not filled with bundles of paper. On top lay a single object, a thick, heavy journal, its dark leather cover worn smooth with use. It was unmarked, with no name or title. It simply lay there. Its pages filled with a story she was now certain was connected to the fortune beside it. The weight of it in her hands felt immense, a physical manifestation of a life's work, or a life's secret. Beneath the journal, there was more. She carefully lifted it out, the old leather cool against her skin, and set it aside. The rest of the satchel was filled with a series of heavy paper tubes, rolled tightly and tied with lengths of twine. They were stiff and fragile with age. She chose one at random, her fingers fumbling with the knot. It took a moment to unpick the brittle twine, and then she carefully, slowly, unrolled the tube. It was a map, not a road map, but something else. It was covered in complex lines, strange symbols, and handwritten notations. The paper was thick, high-quality vellum. She unrolled another, and another. They were all the same type of map, all detailing the same area, the land she was currently standing on, and the vast tracts surrounding it. They were geological surveys, detailed, professional, and dense with information she didn't understand. She saw notations for rock strata, depth measurements, and mineral compositions. She ran her flashlight over one of the largest maps, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar symbols. Then she saw it, a huge section of the map, directly beneath the marked location of the rail yard, was cross-hatched in red ink. Next to it, a single, handwritten annotation in neat, cursive script, a chemical formula, Fe2O3, followed by 2 words, massive vein. Her high school chemistry, a lifetime ago, flickered in her memory. Fe, iron, a massive vein of iron ore. She looked from the map to the stack of deeds, to the bundles of bonds, to the silent, waiting journal. The pieces of the puzzle began to click together in her mind, forming a terrifying, exhilarating picture. This wasn't just a lost fortune. The bonds and deeds were the motive, the maps were the prize, and the journal, she knew with a sudden, chilling certainty, held the story of the crime. She was no longer just a desperate woman in a cold train car. She had stumbled into a decades-old conspiracy, and she was holding all the evidence in her hands. A deep, bone-rattling chill went through her, a cold that had nothing to do with the damp air of the tunnel. This was the cold of fear. This much money, this much land, this valuable a secret. People didn't just lose these things. They were taken. This secret was buried here for a reason. Whoever had put it here was either hiding from someone or they had been silenced. A wave of nausea, sharper than any hunger pang, rose in her throat. By finding this, she had not just found a potential salvation, she had stepped into a story that was not finished. She had picked up a thread that someone, somewhere, might still be watching. The joy and disbelief of a moment ago curdled into a raw, intelligent fear. This was dangerous. This secret had teeth, and it had been sleeping in the dark for 60 years, and she had just woken it up. The thought of Leo, alone in the car above, flashed in her mind, and her fear was instantly magnified 1,000 times. She quickly and carefully began to put everything back. Her hands, which had been trembling with excitement, were now shaking with a new and potent terror. She rolled the maps, her fingers clumsy, and retied them with the brittle twine. She placed them back in the satchel, the heavy journal on top. She closed the flap, its click echoing in the profound silence. She did the same with the other satchel, the one containing the bonds and deeds, the immense paper weight of the fortune, feeling less like a blessing and more like a curse. Every sound was magnified, every rustle of paper a potential betrayal. She felt watched, even down here, 30 feet beneath the earth. The ghost of whoever this belonged to, the ghost of the crime itself, felt present in the chamber with her, a cold spot in the already freezing air. She had to get out. She had to get back to her son. She grabbed the satchels, one in each hand. They were incredibly heavy. The weight of them, the sheer physical burden, was a testament to their value and their danger. She couldn't possibly climb the ladder carrying them both. She would have to make 2 trips. The thought of leaving them, even for a moment, was terrifying. But the thought of staying down here any longer was unbearable. She made a decision. She would take the satchel with the journal and maps first. The story, the proof. That felt more important, more dangerous than the money. She slung the heavy leather strap over her shoulder, the bag bumping against her hip, and turned back toward the tunnel, her flashlight beam bouncing nervously off the damp brick walls. The journey down had been one of fearful discovery. The journey back up, she knew, would be a climb of pure, unadulterated dread. The climb was an agony of fear. Every muscle in her body screamed, partly from the strain of carrying the heavy satchel, partly from the adrenaline coursing through her. The metal rungs were slick and cold beneath her fingers. She imagined a hand grabbing her ankle from the darkness below. She imagined the hatch above her slamming shut, plunging her into eternal blackness. The beam of her phone light seemed to be dimming, a trick of her panicked mind. The sounds of the rail yard, which had been a distant menace, now felt like an immediate threat. What if someone had heard the hatch? What if someone was waiting for her up there? Her breath came in ragged, painful gasps. She didn't dare look down. She just kept climbing, her eyes fixed on the small square of grimy light above, the entrance back to her world. A world that was now infinitely more complicated and dangerous than it had been just an hour ago. Finally, her hand reached the top and grasped the edge of the floor. She hauled herself and the heavy satchel out of the opening, collapsing onto the filthy floor of the train car, panting and trembling. The air in the car, as foul and mouldy as it was, felt sweet and fresh compared to the tomb below. She lay there for a moment, her heart threatening to burst from her chest. Leo was exactly where she had left him, huddled in the blankets, his eyes huge and dark. He hadn't moved. Relief, so potent it felt like a drug, washed through her. She was safe. He was safe. For now. But the weight of the satchel pressing into her side was a constant, heavy reminder that to mend to safety was a fragile illusion. She had to go back down one more time. The thought filled her with a dread so profound it was physically nauseating, but she knew she couldn't leave that fortune behind. It was their only leverage, their only hope. The second trip was faster, fueled by sheer terror. She practically flew down the ladder, her mind a blank slate of fear. She grabbed the second satchel, the one with the bonds and deeds, slung it over her shoulder, and scrambled back up without letting herself think. Back in the car, gasping for breath. She heaved the heavy trapdoor closed. The boom as it settled into place was a sound of finality. She then shoved the loose floorboards back into position, kicking dirt and grime over the telltale cracks, trying frantically to erase any sign of what she had done. It was a pathetic, useless gesture, but it was all she could do. She felt like a criminal, a thief, and a fool. She had disturbed a grave, and she had no idea what kind of ghost she had just invited into her life. The two heavy leather satchels, now hidden under the thin blankets beside her sleeping son, radiated a palpable sense of danger that filled the small, cold space. The mystery of their discovery was over, but the mystery of their consequence had just begun. Hours later, after the terror of the tunnel had subsided into a low, humming dread, Eleanor sat with the two satchels huddled beside her in the darkness. The cold was a physical presence, a predator stalking the edges of their thin blankets, but a different kind of chill now emanated from the heavy leather bags. It was the cold of a long-dead secret. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, a familiar dull ache. But her mind was consumed by a different kind of hunger, the need to know. She could not touch the bonds or the deeds again. They felt cursed, heavy with the weight of stolen lives. But the journal was different. It held a voice, a story. With trembling fingers, she pulled the thick, worn book from its satchel. The leather cover was smooth and cool, like a stone from a deep river. She felt a powerful sense of trespass, of opening a tomb. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that tasted of mold and dust, she opened the first page, her phone's flashlight beam illuminating the faded ink of a life she was about to disturb. It was the only way forward. The air in the car seemed to grow heavier, more silent, as she began to read. The journal belonged to a man named Arthur. His handwriting was a geologist's script, precise, angular, and economical. The first entries, dated in the spring of 1962, were filled with an almost boyish excitement. He wrote not of people, but of the earth itself. The smell of the old paper was thick and musty, the scent of time itself. Elena felt a strange kinship with this man she had never met, a man whose final secrets were now resting in her lap. Her heart pounded in a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs, a drumbeat of anticipation and fear. She read of his meticulous work, his survey lines, his core samples. She could almost hear his voice in the crisp, descriptive prose, a man in love with the hidden world beneath his feet. She felt her own desperate world recede, the cold and hunger fading into the background as she was pulled deeper and deeper into Arthur's story, a story that had been waiting 60 years in the dark for a reader, a witness. He found it in July. The entry was electric, the script suddenly looser, more urgent. Elena leaned closer, her eyes scanning the page, her breath held tight in her chest. "It's here," Arthur wrote. "My God, the sheer scale of it. It's not a deposit, it's a river, a subterranean river of pure, high-grade iron ore flowing for miles beneath this forgotten valley. The instruments don't lie. This vein could power the state's industry for a century. It's the kind of discovery a man dreams of, the find that makes a career, that builds cities. I walked the surface today, above my discovery, and the world looked different. The dry grass, the struggling farms, the impoverished soil, they are all a lie. A thin crust of poverty covering a kingdom of iron. I felt like a king who had discovered his own treasure, a secret known only to me and the deep, silent earth. I have to be careful, I have to be certain, but I know what is sleeping beneath my feet. This changes everything. Elena felt a vicarious thrill, a shadow of the joy he must have felt. That joy was short-lived. A few weeks later, the tone of the journal shifted dramatically. The scientific observations were replaced by a growing moral unease. Elena felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her own stomach as she read Arthur's words. "The lie is not the poverty," he wrote. "The lie is my silence. I have overlaid the property maps with my geological survey. The vein does not run under empty land. It runs directly beneath the homes and farms of nearly 200 families. Small holdings, most of them passed down through generations. These are poor people, worked to the bone for a meager existence, completely unaware of the fortune they are living on. Who do I tell? If I go to the state or to a mining corporation, these families will be swept aside for pennies on the dollar. They will be displaced, their history erased. I cannot let that happen. This wealth belongs to them. I have made a decision. I will not be the agent of their destruction. I will be their advocate. I have begun visiting them, collecting copies of their deeds, with a plan to form a cooperative. Together, they can be powerful." The name first appeared in a short, worried entry in late August. Coronel Barreto. Eleanor's blood ran cold at the title. "A local land baron, a man named Coronel Barreto, has taken an interest in my work," Arthur wrote, the script tighter now, more controlled. "He is not an educated man, but he is shrewd. He owns most of the businesses in the county and holds the politicians in his pocket. He moves like a predator, always circling, always watching. His eyes do not see you, they calculate your worth, your angle, your weakness. He approached me today by the creek, asking casual questions about the rock strata. The questions were too specific for a layman. Someone has been talking. He smells the money just as a shark smells blood in the water. I told him I was merely surveying for groundwater, but I do not think he believed me. There is a profound darkness in that man, a hunger that is never satisfied. I feel his eyes on me even when he is not there. I must work faster. The families are beginning to trust me. Their hope is a fragile, beautiful thing." The last entry was dated September 12, 1962. It was short, chaotic, and terrifying. The handwriting was a frantic scrawl, the ink smudged in places as if by a trembling, sweaty hand. Eleanor felt the fear coming off the page like a physical heat. Barreto knows what it began, the words crashing into each other. "He came to my camp tonight with 2 of his men. No pretense this time. He knows about the iron. He offered to buy my surveys, my silence. He offered me a fortune. I refused. I told him the discovery belonged to the people who owned the land. He just smiled. It was not a human smile. It was the baring of teeth. He told me I was a fool, that the land would be his, one way or another. He left, but I know he will be back. I can hear their truck in the distance. They are coming back for me. I have to hide this. The deeds, the bonds I collected for the families, the maps. The truth must survive. Even if I do not, I am putting this in the tunnel. It is the only safe place." The entry ended there. A final, dark smear of ink trailed off the page. A silent testament to a life cut short. Elena slammed the journal shut, a choked sob escaping her lips. It was a story of murder. Arthur wasn't a ghost. He was a victim, his final desperate act to hide the truth in the dark belly of the earth, and she had found it. The bonds were the family's nest egg. The deeds were their proof of ownership. The maps were the treasure. Coronel Barreto had murdered Arthur, stolen his research, and then, over the next decade, systematically terrorized and forced those 200 families off their land, consolidating it for himself. He had been waiting, biding his time to exploit the mine. A wave of nausea and rage washed over Eleanor. She felt the immense weight of the story settle upon her. She was no longer just a desperate mother. She was the custodian of a 60-year-old crime. the keeper of a dead man's promise. The two leather satchels beside her were no longer a potential fortune. They were evidence. They were justice, waiting in the dark. And she, somehow, had to bring them into the light. Several days passed. The knowledge of the secret festered in the small, cold car, a source of both terror and a strange, defiant strength. Elena rationed the last of a loaf of bread she had bought, her hunger a dull, constant ache. But now it was overshadowed by a new, sharper feeling. Fear. She felt hunted. Every sound from the rail yard, every distant shout, every clang of metal made her heart leap into her throat. Then one afternoon, a new sound cut through the desolate symphony of the yard. It was a sound so alien, so out of place, that it felt like an invasion. The low, powerful rumble of an expensive car engine. It grew steadily louder, a deep-throated purr that spoke of wealth and authority. It wasn't the sputtering engine of a junk collector's truck or the high whine of a police cruiser. This was different. A knot of pure dread formed in Elena's stomach. She knew with a certainty that defied logic that the sound was connected to the secret she was hiding. The ghost of Coronel Barreto was no longer a story in a book. It was coming for her. A sleek black sedan, its paint job gleaming even in the grimy light of the rail yard, pulled to a stop just 50 feet from her train car. The mud and gravel crunched under its expensive tires. For a moment, nothing happened. The engine idled, a low, predatory hum. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. She scrambled to shove the leather satchels deeper beneath the thin blankets, trying to shield them from view. Then, the driver's side door opened. A man in a dark, perfectly tailored suit stepped out. He was tall and moved with a fluid, unnerving confidence, his polished leather shoes a stark insult to the filthy ground. He smoothed his suit jacket, his gaze sweeping over the landscape of decay before landing, with pinpoint accuracy, on her car. On her. A feeling of absolute cold washed over Elena. It was him. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. He was the inheritor of the crime, the grandson, the continuation of the story, and he was walking directly toward her. He didn't hesitate. He walked through the filth and debris as if it weren't there, his path straight and unwavering. Elena felt frozen, trapped in the open doorway of the train car. She wanted to run, to slam the heavy door shut, but her body refused to obey. He stopped just a few feet away, his shadow falling over her, plunging her into a sudden chill. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps in his late 40s, with dark hair and a handsome, unlined face. But his eyes were ancient. They were the eyes Arthur had described in his journal, cold, dark, and calculating. They took in everything in a single, indismissive glance: the squalor of the car, the patched blankets, her own worn clothes, and Leo, who was peeking out from behind her legs, his small face a mask of fear. Elena felt pinned by that gaze, stripped bare and judged. She felt like a bug under a microscope, a minor infestation to be analyzed and then exterminated. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken threat. "I am Mr. Rocha," he finally said. His voice was smooth, cultured, and completely devoid of warmth. It was the sound of money and power. "I'm the CEO of Rocha Mining and Logistics." He made a vague gesture with a perfectly manicured hand, encompassing the entire rail yard. "My company has recently finalized the acquisition of this entire parcel of land. We have a major development project slated to begin here very shortly, which means we are clearing the area of all abandoned equipment and debris." His eyes flickered toward her again, and the pause was deliberate, insulting. A cold fury began to burn beneath Elena's fear. He was speaking to her as if she were just another piece of trash to be swept away. His gaze then shifted down to Leo, who flinched and hid further behind her. A faint, unreadable expression crossed Rocha's face. It wasn't sympathy. It was something else. A flicker of annoyance, perhaps. The coldness in his eyes intensified, and a shiver crawled up Elena's spine. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced a thick white business envelope. It looked pristine, impossibly clean in the grimy air. "My surveyors reported that this car was occupied," he said, the word dripping with disdain. "Company policy dictates that we offer relocation assistance." He held the envelope out to her. "There is $1,000 in here, cash." It should be more than enough to help you and your son find a more suitable place to live. A real apartment, perhaps. The offer hung in the air between them. $1,000. The number was staggering. It was a lifeline. It was food, warmth, a locked door, safety. A month ago, she would have wept with gratitude. She would have snatched it from his hand without a second thought. But now, she knew what it was. It was not a gift. It was a transaction. It was the price of a secret. It was blood money, offered by the grandson of a murderer to the woman who had found his victim's grave. Elena stared at the white envelope, then back up at Mr. Roche's emotionless face. The words from Arthur's journal screamed in her mind, a frantic, silent alarm. He offered to buy my silence. He offered me a fortune. I refused. 60 years had passed, but nothing had changed. The same offer, the same cold smile, the same fundamental evil stood before her, wrapped in a more modern, sophisticated package. It was the same dark soul, passed from grandfather to grandson, her hand, which she knew she should raise to accept the money, to save her child, felt as heavy as stone. It remained frozen at her side. The hunger in her stomach warred with the righteous fury in her heart. She said nothing. She couldn't form the words to accept or refuse. She simply stood her ground, her silence a wall, her gaze holding his. In that moment, in the desolate rail yard, the battle that Arthur had lost 60 years ago was joined once again, and Mr. Roche knew she was refusing. The smooth mask of civility on Roche's face did not crack, but his eyes hardened, the calculating warmth vanishing completely, replaced by a flat, reptilian coldness. He slowly, deliberately, withdrew the envelope and slipped it back into his jacket. The offer was rescinded. "It's a mistake," he said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing purr that was far more terrifying than a shout. "You should have taken the money." He took a half-step closer, invading her personal space, forcing her to look up at him. "This is not a safe place, you know, for a child." He looked pointedly at the rusted, crumbling metal of the train car's roof, then at the shattered windows. A fire could start so easily out here. A structural collapse. Tragic accidents happen all the time to people who are in the wrong place. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a promise, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who had never known consequences. "It's my final offer. Be gone by tomorrow." He turned, his back to her, and walked away. Elena stood trembling, her arms wrapped around a terrified Leo, watching the black car disappear. The echo of his threat, "Accidents happen," hung in the cold air like a toxic fog. The $1,000 he had offered was a tangible escape, a path to food and a warm bed, a way to immediately shield her son from this nightmare. But accepting it would mean letting Roche win. It would mean spitting on Arthur's grave and condemning the legacy of those 200 families to be forgotten forever. It would mean her silence would be the final nail in the coffin of justice. But to refuse, to stay and fight, what would that mean? It would mean facing a man who was powerful, ruthless, and who had already threatened her child's life. She was alone, penniless, and trapped. The weight of the 2 satchels, the evidence of a historic crime, felt like a millstone around her neck, threatening to drown her and her son. What would you do in her place? Would you take the money and run, securing your child's immediate safety? Or would you risk everything to fight for a justice 60 years in the making? Roche's threat hung in the air long after the sound of his engine disappeared, a toxic residue that coated everything. The phrase, "accidents happen," played on a loop in Elena's mind, each repetition colder and sharper than the last. The rail yard, which had been a place of grim survival, now felt like a death trap, each shadow a potential assassin, every gust of wind a whisper of Roche's promise. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. She looked down at Leo, who was clinging to her leg, his face pale with a fear he was too young to understand, but too smart to ignore. The $1,000 she had refused felt like a ghost, a phantom of a safety she had willingly sacrificed. But for what? For a dead man's journal and a justice that seemed impossibly distant. A profound terror, colder and more paralyzing than any hunger, seized her. She was a target now. Her pathetic anonymity was gone, burned away by the cold fire in Roche's eyes. They were not just homeless, they were hunted. The silence in the car was no longer empty, it was waiting. just as the sun began its slow, bleeding descent, painting the rusted metal in hues of orange and blood. A movement at the edge of her vision made her flinch. It wasn't the sleek, predatory form of Rocha's sedan. It was a stooped, slow-moving figure, silhouetted against the dying light. The shape was familiar, a part of the rail yard's desolate landscape. An old man, bent nearly double under the weight of years, was pushing a rickety cart overloaded with twisted pieces of scrap metal. The screech of its unoiled wheels was a familiar, mournful sound, the yard's unofficial anthem. Elena had seen him many times from a distance, a scavenger like herself, but one who was scavenging for survival, not for secrets. He always kept to himself, his face hidden by the brim of a filthy hat, a silent ghost moving through the steel graveyard. But tonight, he was not following his usual meandering path. He had stopped, and he was looking directly at her train car, his posture uncharacteristically still, her breath caught in her throat. The old man began to move again, not away, but towards her. Each step was slow, deliberate, his worn boots crunching softly on the gravel. Elena's muscles tensed, her body coiling into a state of high alert. Was he one of Rocha's spies, an informant paid in scraps and liquor to watch the yard's destitute inhabitants? The cart's squealing wheels sounded like a siren in the tense quiet. She instinctively pushed Leo further behind her, creating a fragile human shield. The man came closer, and she could begin to see his face in the gloom. It was a roadmap of hardship, a landscape of deep wrinkles and sun-weathered skin. His eyes, however, were not cold or calculating like Rocha's. They were a pale, watery blue, and they held a deep, profound sadness, the look of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. He stopped a respectful distance away, his gnarled hands, stained with grease and rust, resting on the handle of his cart. The silence stretched between them, thick with questions. "Heard the engine," the old man finally said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, like stones grinding together. "Saw the fancy car. That kind of car only brings one kind of trouble out here." He nodded his head slowly, a gesture of grim understanding. He wasn't looking at her with pity, but with a strange, unnerving recognition. "You and the boy. You shouldn't be here." His gaze was direct, his watery eyes seeming to see straight through her, past the fear and the hunger, to the heavy secret she was carrying. In that moment, Eleanor's carefully constructed wall of suspicion began to crumble. This was not a predator. This was a fellow survivor. This was a man who understood the rail yard's brutal language. A desperate, irrational impulse took hold of her. She could not bear the weight of Arthur's story alone another second. It was too heavy, too dangerous. Taking a shallow, trembling breath, she made a choice, a leap of faith into the unknown, trusting the sadness in a stranger's eyes. She stepped out of the train car, into the encroaching twilight, her body trembling. I think I'm in terrible trouble," she whispered, the words feeling small and inadequate. The old man just nodded again, his expression unchanging, as if he had been expecting this confession. Eleanor fumbled with one of the satchels, her fingers clumsy with cold and fear. She pulled out a single, folded document. It was one of the deeds, its paper yellowed and fragile. She held it out to him, her hand shaking so badly that the paper rattled. Do you recognize any of the names on this land?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sighing wind. "It's from a long time ago. It was an insane risk. She was showing a piece of a murdered man's evidence to a complete stranger. But her instincts, the same instincts that had led her down into the dark tunnel, were screaming at her that this was the right thing to do, that this man was somehow connected to the story she had unearthed." The old man wiped his hand on his filthy trousers before reaching out to take the deed. His touch was surprisingly gentle, his calloused, gnarled fingers cradling the ancient paper as if it were a delicate, sleeping bird. He held it close to his face, his pale eyes squinting in the fading light, tracing the faded, curling script. Elena held her breath, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The world seemed to shrink to this single moment, the old man, the fragile paper, and the 60-year-old secret that hung between them. For a long moment, he was utterly still, the only movement the slight tremor in his hands. Then, a sound escaped his lips. It was a low, choked gasp, a sound of profound, heart-wrenching recognition. His entire body seemed to change, the weary slump of his shoulders straightening as if jolted by an electric current. He stared at the paper, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with a disbelief so pure it was painful to witness. The ghost she had unearthed had just found its voice. He raised a trembling finger and traced a name on the document. Silvio Cordero, he whispered, his voice cracking with an emotion so raw it made Elena's own eyes sting. That was my father. This was his land. The words fell into the quiet air, heavy and unbelievable. He looked up at her, and the deep sadness in his eyes had been replaced by a storm of confusion, grief, and a dawning, terrible hope. My God, after all these years, where did you find this? How? Tears began to well in his pale eyes, spilling over and tracing clean paths through the grime on his weathered cheeks. He wasn't just a random scavenger. He was one of them. He was a son of the stolen land, the last living remnant of the community Arthur had tried to save. Elena felt a dizzying sense of fate, as if a thread she had blindly pulled in the dark had led her directly to the one person in the world who could help her weave the rest of the story together. The final piece of the puzzle had just sat down in front of her. Seeing the raw truth of his grief, the dam of Elena's own fear and isolation broke. The story poured out of her in a frantic, desperate torrent. She told him everything. The gutted train car, the loose floorboard, the heavy iron ring of the hatch. She described the descent into the cold, brick-lined tunnel, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and time. She spoke of the two heavy leather satchels, waiting in the dark chamber like sleeping guardians. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper as she described the contents, the impossible stacks of bonds, the dozens of deeds for land that now belonged to him and his lost community, the intricate geological maps detailing a king's ransom in iron ore. She saved the heart of the story for last, her voice trembling as she spoke of the journal, of the good man named Arthur, and of the dark, predatory evil of the man he had named, Coronel Barreto. The story, finally shared, felt both more real and more terrifying than ever. The name, Coronel Barreto, was like a lit match dropped on dry tinder. The old man, Silvio, spat on the dusty ground, a gesture of pure, undiluted venom. The grief on his face hardened into a mask of ancient rage. "Coronel," he hissed, the word a curse. He was no colonel. He was a thief, a murderer, the devil himself, come to walk among us. The story he told then was not from a book. It was etched into his memory, a childhood trauma that had shaped his entire life. He spoke of a time when the valley was green, when the small farms were poor but proud. Then Barreto arrived. Silvio's voice grew low and raspy as he recounted the campaign of terror. It started small, he said, his eyes distant. A fence cut in the night, a well poisoned. Then the fires started. Barns, sheds, always ruled an accident, but we knew it was him. He was bleeding us out, one small cut at a time, making us desperate enough to sell our history for pennies. Elena listened, horrified, realizing Rocha's threat was not new. It was a family tradition. Silvio's gaze drifted to the darkening horizon, as if he could see the ghosts of the past playing out against the sky. My father was a proud man. He refused to sell. He said this land had fed our family for 100 years, and it would feed us for 100 more. Many were like him. They tried to band together, to fight back. That's when the map man came. Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Arthur," she whispered. Silvio nodded slowly. That was his name, Arthur. A quiet, kind man, with honest eyes. He didn't treat us like ignorant farmers. He talked to my father for hours, showing him papers, explaining things. He told us the ground beneath our feet was a treasure, that we were all kings and didn't know it. For the first time in years, we felt hope, real hope. Arthur was collecting our papers, our deeds. He was going to help us form a cooperative, to claim our own wealth. He was our angel, sent to save us from the devil. The parallels to her own discovery were chillingly exact. She was living a second, rhyming verse of Arthur's poem. And then, he was gone, Silvio continued, his voice dropping to a hollow whisper. The rage in his face was replaced by that deep, familiar sadness. One morning, his camp was empty. His truck was gone. Barreto's men put the word out that he'd just packed up and left, that he was a con artist who'd skipped town. But we knew we weren't stupid. The night before, we heard shouting from his camp. My father saw Barreto's truck leaving in the dark, driving fast with no lights. We knew the devil had taken our angel, and when Arthur disappeared, our hope disappeared with him. He paused, swallowing hard, the memory still a raw wound after all these years. Without the deeds Arthur had collected, without his maps, we had no proof, no power. One by one, the families gave up. My father was one of the last. He died a broken man, working in a factory in the city, dreaming of the land Barreto had stolen. I am the last one left who remembers the truth. He had not just survived, he had become a living archive of the crime. Silvio turned to look at Elena, and the sadness in his eyes was now mixed with a fierce, protective urgency. This man who came to see you, Rocha, he is Barreto's grandson. He inherited the stolen land, the secret, and the poison in his blood. I have seen him. He has his grandfather's eyes, the eyes of a wolf. By finding that tunnel, you have done more than find some old papers. You have dug up the body Barreto tried to bury 60 years ago. His gnarled hand shot out and gripped her arm, his fingers surprisingly strong. He knows you found something. He is not a man who makes idle threats. He will not let you or your boy live to tell this story. He will kill you, burn this metal coffin, and tell the world it was just another tragic accident in the rail yard. It's what his family does. It's all they know. The past was not the past. It was a loaded gun, and its barrel was now pointed directly at Elena's head. His words were not a warning. They were a prophecy. You cannot spend another night here, Silvio insisted, his voice a low, urgent rasp. Not one more hour. His warning struck Elena with the force of a physical blow. The abstract fear she'd been living with coalesced into a single, terrifying image. A wall of fire, with her and Leo trapped inside. This wasn't a possibility. It was a certainty. Silvio's story was the final, horrifying confirmation. Rocha wasn't just a ruthless businessman. He was the heir to a legacy of murder and arson, and he was about to repeat the sins of his grandfather. My shack, Silvio said, pointing with a trembling finger toward a dilapidated structure nestled against a mountain of industrial junk. It ain't much. It's made of scraps, but it's hidden. He'll be watching this car. He won't think to look for you there. We go now before the moon is high. The choice was gone. There was no more debate, no more weighing of options. There was only survival. The fight for justice would have to wait. The fight for their next breath was happening right now. A frantic, focused energy seized Elena. Despair was a luxury she could no longer afford. She scrambled back into the train car, her movements swift and silent. She grabbed their thin blankets and her worn cardboard suitcase, shoving the few clothes they owned inside with practiced speed. Then came the real treasure. She handled the two heavy leather satchels with a reverence born of terror, placing them carefully at the bottom of her own suitcase. Piling their meager clothes on top as a pathetic camouflage, the weight of the case was immense now, a physical burden that mirrored the crushing weight of the secret it contained. The deeds, the bonds, the maps, and the voice of a murdered man. It was all here, her responsibility, her curse, and her only weapon. She felt a surge of defiant strength. Rocha could burn the car, but he would not burn the truth. Not if she could help it. She was no longer a victim waiting for an accident. She was a courier, and her delivery was 60 years overdue. She knelt in front of Leo, who was watching her frantic packing with wide, silent eyes. She forced her face into a mask of calm, a reassuring smile that felt brittle and fake. "Okay, mijo," she whispered, her voice steady, despite the frantic beating of her heart. "We're going to play a game, a secret adventure game. We have to leave our house here and go to Mr. Silvio's house, but we have to be spies. That means we have to be very, very quiet. Not a single sound. Can you do that for Mama? Can you be my best spy?" He looked from her face to the kind, worried face of the old man, and then nodded solemnly, his small jaw set with a determination that broke his mother's heart. He was too young for games like this, for a world where home was a place you had to flee in the dark. She kissed his forehead, the skin cool and damp. "I love you," she whispered. "Stay right with me. Don't let go of my hand." The lie of a game was a fragile shield, but it was the only one she had to protect him from the coming terror. They waited in the deep shadows of the train car's doorway as the last vestiges of daylight died, plunging the rail yard into a profound and menacing darkness. The familiar sounds of the yard seemed different now, each one amplified, each one a potential threat. The distant clang of metal on metal was the sound of a weapon being readied. The low moan of the wind through the derelict cars was the sound of ghosts whispering warnings. Elena's senses were stretched to their breaking point. Every nerve ending fizzed with adrenaline. She could hear the blood pounding in her ears, a frantic drumbeat counting down the seconds until Rocha's men arrived. She held the impossibly heavy suitcase in one hand and Leo's small cold hand in the other. Silvio stood beside them, a silent, stooped sentinel, his eyes scanning the darkness, his body tense. The waiting was an agony, a slow-motion torture that stretched each second into an eternity of fear. They were suspended in the terrifying, silent moment before the explosion. A low whistle, soft as a bird's call, cut through the night. It was Silvio's signal. It was time. Now, he breathed. Elena tightened her grip on Leo's hand and pulled him out of the train car, out of the relative safety of their steel tomb, and into the exposed, hostile darkness of the rail yard. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. They were shadows moving among shadows. The journey to Silvio's shack was only 100 yards, but it felt like a mile-long tightrope walk over a pit of fire. They moved in a low crouch, ducking behind the massive, rusted wheels of a freight train, their feet crunching softly on the gravel. Every sound was a betrayal. A piece of loose metal rattled under Silvio's foot, and they all froze, their hearts stopping for a beat. The silence that followed was deafening. Elena's lungs burned from holding her breath. Leo, true to his promise, was utterly silent, a small, brave shadow clinging to her hand. The fear was so intense it was a physical taste in her mouth, metallic and bitter. They reached the shack, a patchwork of scrap tin and rotting wood that seemed to have grown out of a junk pile. It was invisible unless you knew it was there. Silvio fumbled with a makeshift lock, his hands shaking, and then pushed the door open, ushering them into the absolute blackness within. He quickly barred the door behind them, the heavy thud of the wooden beam echoing in the tiny space. The air inside was thick with the smells of old wood smoke, machine oil, and damp earth. A single cot was pressed against one wall, a small wood stove in the corner. It was a hovel, but with the door barred, it felt like the most secure fortress in the world. Elena practically collapsed onto the cot, her legs giving out from under her. The heavy suitcase dropped to the dirt floor with a muffled thud. The adrenaline that had fueled her began to recede, leaving her trembling and nauseous. They were safe, for now. The thought was a fragile comfort in the suffocating dark. Silvio moved to the shack's only window, a single, grimy pane of glass, no bigger than a book. He scraped a small patch clean with his thumbnail, creating a peephole that looked directly out at Elena's train car, now a dark, silent hulk in the faint moonlight. "We watch," he whispered, his voice grim. "We wait." Elena crept to his side, pulling Leo with her. She peered through the small opening. The train car looked exactly as they had left it, a forlorn and forgotten piece of junk. For a moment, a sliver of doubt entered her mind. Had they overreacted? Had she dragged her son through the dark on the paranoid ramblings of an old man? The minutes ticked by, each one stretching into an eternity. The only sound was the frantic beating of her own heart and Leo's quiet, scared breaths. She began to feel a fool, a hysterical mother who had let fear run away with her. Maybe Rocha's threat was just that, a threat. Maybe they would have been safe. Maybe she had made a terrible mistake. Then she saw them, two figures, materializing from the deep shadows near the tracks. They moved with a purpose and efficiency that immediately marked them as different from the rail yard's usual drifters. They were dressed in dark clothing, their movements fluid and coordinated, like wolves stalking their prey. A fresh wave of ice-cold terror washed over Elena, eradicating her momentary doubt. Silvio had been right. They were here. Rocha hadn't been bluffing. Her breath hitched in her throat, a small, strangled sound. Silvio placed a calming hand on her shoulder, but it did little to stop the violent trembling that seized her body. The two men approached the train car without hesitation, their path direct and unwavering. They weren't there to investigate. They were there to execute a command. The abstract threat had just become two flesh-and-blood monsters, walking through the night to murder her and her son. The reality of it was so stark, so brutal, that her mind struggled to accept what her eyes were seeing. The moonlight glinted off something one of the men was carrying, a heavy, rectangular can. Then the other man lifted his, and there was no doubt. They were gas cans. Elena felt the air leave her lungs in a silent scream, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle any sound. They were going to burn it. They weren't just going to scare her. They were going to incinerate the car, her and her child, erasing them from existence and turning the evidence of their murder into a tragic news story about homeless vagrants. The sheer, cold-blooded evil of it was staggering. She pulled Leo into her body, burying his face in her stomach, trying to shield his innocent eyes from the horror unfolding outside. He began to whimper, sensing the new, sharper edge of his mother's terror. "Shh, mijo, shh, it's okay. It's just the game," she whispered, the lie crumbling in her mouth. She could feel the men's malice from across the yard, a palpable, radiating cold that had nothing to do with the night air. The two men worked with a chilling, business-like efficiency. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. One stood watch while the other unscrewed the cap of the first can. The faint, acrid smell of gasoline drifted on the wind, a chemical promise of the violence to come. The man began to splash the liquid liberally around the base of the train car, soaking the dry weeds and the rusted metal undercarriage. He moved around the entire car, methodically dousing it, ensuring the fire would be fast and absolute. Elena watched, mesmerized and horrified, as they prepared her funeral pyre. She thought of their thin blankets inside, the worn picture book, the small, clean corner she had swept. She saw it all being consumed by flame, a brutal erasure of their brief, miserable existence there. A part of her mind detached, watching the scene as if it were a movie, unable to process that this was real, that just minutes ago she and her son had been inside that metal coffin, waiting for this exact moment. The man finished emptying the first can, tossing it aside with a careless clatter. The other man handed him a small object, a matchbook. He opened it, tore one out, and swiped it against the striking strip. A tiny, brilliant flare of light erupted in the darkness, illuminating his face for a fraction of a second. It was a young face, impassive and bored, the face of a man just doing his job. That casual indifference was the most terrifying thing of all. He knelt and touched the tiny flame to a gasoline-soaked patch of weeds. The result was not a flicker, but an explosion. A sudden, violent whoosh of sound and light as the gasoline vapors ignited in a single, devastating instant. A ball of brilliant orange fire erupted, climbing the side of the train car in a hungry wave. The heat was instantaneous, a physical force that she could feel even from inside the shack, a blast of hot air that made the grimy window pane rattle in its frame. The night was banished, replaced by a terrible, roaring dawn. The train car that had been her prison and her sanctuary was instantly engulfed in a maelstrom of fire. The flames, a furious, roaring orange, shot 30 feet into the night sky, illuminating the entire rail yard in a flickering, hellish light. The sound was a deafening roar, a hungry beast devouring the old metal, punctuated by the sharp crackle of burning debris and the explosive pop of the remaining shattered windows. Elena watched, her face pressed against the glass, mesmerized by the terrible beauty of the destruction. She saw the spot where they had slept, the corner where Leo had played with his truck, the doorway where Rocha had delivered his threat, all of it consumed by the inferno. It was a funeral pyre, just as Silvio had predicted. It was the physical manifestation of Rocha's ruthlessness, a fiery exclamation point on his 60-year-old crime. Tears streamed down her face, tears not of sorrow for the lost hovel, but of rage and a new, terrifying clarity. As the flames clawed at the sky, turning the metal of the car a glowing cherry red, Elena automatically clutched her own heavy suitcase to her chest. The leather of the satchels inside felt cool against her body, a stark contrast to the searing heat radiating from the window. Rocha thought he was destroying the evidence. He thought he was burning the last loose end, the last witness. He had no idea he had failed. He had not erased the secret. He had only consecrated it in fire. The blaze was not an ending, it was a signal. It was a declaration of war. The fear that had paralyzed Elena for days was burned away in that inferno, replaced by something hard and cold and sharp. Resolve. She looked from the fire to the two heavy satchels that held the truth. The ghost of Arthur, the memories of Silvio's family, the future of her own son, it all rested with her. The fire wasn't a tragedy. It was a baptism, and she had just been reborn, no longer as a victim but as a fighter, ready to bring the fire of justice down on the man who started this blaze. The inferno raged for over an hour, a furious, roaring monument to Rocha's evil. From the grimy window of Silvio's shack, Elena watched the train car's metal skeleton twist and sag, its form surrendering to the overwhelming heat. The smell of burning rubber and melted plastic mingled with the acrid scent of gasoline, an odor that would be forever seared into her memory. The fire was a physical manifestation of her deepest fears, a hellscape that had been prepared just for her and her son. But as the flames finally began to die down, leaving behind a glowing, skeletal husk against the pre-dawn sky, the terror in her heart began to cool and harden into something else. It was rage, a cold, diamond-hard rage. She clutched the heavy suitcase to her chest, the leather of the satchels inside a solid, reassuring weight. Silvio, his face a grim mask in the flickering light, finally turned from the window. "He tried to burn the evidence," the old man rasped, his voice thick with a lifetime of fury. "Now, we will use it to burn him." Before the sun had fully risen, casting a sickly grey light over the rail yard, Silvio was in motion. He led Elena to the back of his shack, to an old rotary phone covered in a thick layer of dust. He wiped it clean with his sleeve, his movements filled with a new, urgent purpose. He dialed a number from memory, a number he hadn't called in decades. Elena stood holding Leo's hand, listening to the clicks and whirs of the old phone, each sound a step into an unknown future. The conversation was short, his voice a low, urgent murmur. He spoke of his father, of Coronel Barreto, and of a discovery that could right a 60-year-old wrong. He used words like a proof, murder, and deeds. Finally, he said a name, Sophia, and listened. A moment of silence passed that felt like an eternity. Then, a slow nod. "She will see us," Silvio said, hanging up the phone. "She is a lawyer, a fighter. She helped the Union in the old days. If anyone will listen, it is Sophia." A single, fragile spark of hope ignited in Elena's chest. The bus ride to the nearby town was a blur of anxiety. The Union office was a small, unassuming storefront squeezed between a pawn shop and a boarded-up cantina. The air inside was stale, smelling of old paper, cheap coffee, and lost causes. The lawyer, Sophia, was a woman in her late 50s with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a weary set to her mouth, as if she'd heard every sad story the world had to offer. She listened to their tale with a practiced skepticism, her expression unreadable. Elena felt her fragile hope begin to wither under that piercing gaze. Finally, with trembling hands, Elena unlatched her cardboard suitcase and lifted out the two heavy leather satchels. She placed them on the scarred wooden desk between them. The sound of the heavy leather hitting the wood was a dull, definitive thud. It was the sound of a gauntlet being thrown down. "This," Elena said, her voice shaking but clear, "is Arthur's story, and it's the story of Silvio's father. It is the truth." Sophia's skepticism lingered as she unbuckled the first satchel. She lifted out the journal, its leather cover worn smooth with time. She opened it, her eyes scanning the precise, faded script. Elena watched her face, searching for any change. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, Sophia's eyes widened slightly as she read the passage about Coronel Barreto's first visit. She set the journal aside and pulled out the deeds, her fingers tracing the old signatures, her lips moving silently as she read the names of the families. Finally, she unrolled one of the large geological maps. The professional quality, the detailed notations, the sheer scope of the survey made her sit up straighter. Her finger traced the red cross-hatching until it landed on the two words that changed everything. Massive vein. She looked from the map to Silvio's tear-streaked face, then to Elena's desperate one. The weariness in her eyes was replaced by a fire. "My God," she whispered, her voice filled with awe and fury. "This isn't just a case. This is a reckoning." The small Union office became a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Sophia was no longer a weary local lawyer. She was a general commanding her forces. The first call was not to the local police, who she dismissed with a wave of her hand as being in Barreto's, and now Rocha's, pocket for generations. Instead, she called a trusted contact in the federal police, speaking in a rapid, coded language of case numbers and jurisdictions. The second call was to a renowned investigative journalist, a man famous for toppling corrupt corporations. Within hours, the office was filled with serious-faced men and women in dark suits. Elena watched, dazed, as they treated the satchels with a reverence she had only felt in her terror. They photographed every page of the journal, carefully bagged each bundle of bonds, and encased the maps in protective plastic. She felt the immense weight of the secret being lifted from her shoulders, shared now by people with the power to act. She had carried the torch through the darkness. Now an army had arrived to carry it into the light. The arrest was not a quiet affair in the dead of night. It was a public spectacle, executed at noon the following day. Federal agents, clad in tactical vests, swarmed the gleaming glass and steel lobby of the Rocha Mining and Logistics headquarters. Employees froze, their coffee cups mid-air, as the agents marched directly to the executive elevator. They found Mr. Rocha in his penthouse office, mid-sentence with his legal team, a smug smile on his face. The smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold, aristocratic disbelief as the federal warrant was shoved in his face. He didn't struggle or shout. A profound, chilling arrogance kept him composed, even as the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. As he was led through the lobby, past the glare of the journalist's television camera, he saw Elena standing near the entrance with Sophia and Silvio. For a single, fleeting second, his mask of composure cracked, and his eyes burned with a pure, unadulterated hatred that promised 1,000 more fires, 1,000 more accidents, if only he had the chance. The courtroom became the final stage for Arthur's 60-year-old story. The media frenzy, fueled by the journalist's explosive report, ensured the nation was watching. Rocha's high-priced lawyers tried to dismiss the journal as fiction and the deeds as forgeries, but the evidence was overwhelming. Forensic experts authenticated the age of the ink and paper. The geological maps were proven to be Arthur's work, and modern surveys confirmed the staggering value of the iron ore vein. But the most powerful testimony came from Silvio, who stood not as a frail old man, but as the living voice of 200 stolen histories, his words painting a vivid picture of Barreto's reign of terror. The verdict was a landmark. Rocha was found guilty of conspiracy, massive fraud, and arson, with the judge directly linking his crimes to the predatory and murderous legacy of his grandfather. The mining permit was revoked, and in a historic ruling the court declared all of Barreto's acquisitions fraudulent, restoring the land rights to the cooperative of descendants, represented by Silvio. Eleanor's life transformed with a speed that left her breathless. As the person who had unearthed the truth, and in recognition of the mortal danger she had faced, the newly formed land cooperative awarded her a substantial finder's fee, a sum of money so vast it felt like a dream. She sat in a quiet, carpeted bank office, the kind of place she would have been thrown out of just weeks before, staring at a bank statement. The number on the page had so many zeros it seemed unreal. It was more than just money. It was a wall of security, a fortress that would forever protect her and Leo from the cold winds of poverty. She felt the solid weight of a set of keys in her palm, not to a rusted metal tomb, but to a small, beautiful house with a yard. Later, standing in front of her new home, she watched Leo run across the green grass, his laughter echoing in the clean air. The shame that had been her constant companion, the feeling of being a failure as a mother, finally, blessedly dissolved, replaced by a profound and quiet pride. The new kitchen was filled with light, a stark contrast to the oppressive gloom of the train car. The air smelled not of mold and decay, but of baking bread and fresh coffee. Leo sat at a sturdy wooden table, not shivering in a corner but happily drawing a picture of their new house with a rainbow overhead. At the other end of the kitchen, the gentle, rhythmic hum of a brand-new sewing machine filled the space. Elena sat before it, her hands no longer useless, guiding a piece of soft, bright fabric under the needle. The simple act of creation, of stitching something new and beautiful together, was a balm to her soul. Silvio sat with Leo at the table, a cup of coffee in his hand, a gentle smile on his face. He looked years younger, his back straighter, the haunted look in his eyes replaced by a twinkle of purpose. He was no longer a scavenger of scraps, but the respected head of the Arthur Cordero Justice Fund, an organization Elena had established to help other displaced families fight for their own lost histories. From her window, Eleanor watched her son chase a butterfly across the lawn, his joyful shouts a melody that healed the last of her scars. She thought of the fire, the terrible, beautiful blaze that Rocha had meant for her destruction. Instead, it had forged her. It had burned away her despair and revealed the core of strength she never knew she possessed. She thought of Arthur, the ghost in the machine, a man whose integrity had reached across 6 decades to save a future he would never see. Her incredible fortune wasn't just in the bank. It was in the laughter from her yard, the warm bread on her counter, and the quiet satisfaction of justice served. Her journey from the brink of nothingness was a testament to the fact that even in the deepest darkness, a single person's courage can be the spark that ignites a fire. If you believe that stories of resilience can change the world and that the fight for justice is always worth telling, then subscribe to our channel. There are countless more voices waiting in the dark, ready to be heard.